I started to do podcasts, yes, the censorship was really important. I wanted to bypass censorship and I wanted to say whatever I wanted to say. If you say penis, we just beep it. Or you say this and that, like we directly beep it.
You can't even use those words.
Since it was so easy to produce, a lot of podcasts started to emerge. Now we can say that there's like inflation of podcasts. Good things are happening, like really, even though there are so many censorship and like so many violence, so many discrimination going on around us.
Welcome to Pop and Politics, your guide to art and culture in Turkey. I'm your host, Kenan Besat Sharp. Each week we host an artist, musician, director, writer, actor, or other creative worker in Turkey. Today we're focusing on podcasts in Turkey, and we are joined by Hazal Sipahi, a journalist and successful podcaster. Hazal was educated at King's College London, Bahçeşehir University, University of Arts in Belgrade and beyond. After interning at places like DEPO, Istanbul, and Jazeera, she worked as a project coordinator for NewsLabTurkey, an organization providing training for Turkey's future journalists. Since April 2020, she has hosted the popular podcast Mental Klitoris, a rigorous, well-researched, and also fun project focusing on sex, sexuality, sexual health, sexual violence, gender, and pleasure. With the news website T24, she also hosts the podcast Yayınlanması Kaydıyla, featuring interviews with different figures from Turkey's media landscape. In partnership with the sexual and reproductive health and rights platform Turkey, she hosts the Sexual Health is Your Right podcast. Hazal, welcome to Medyascope.
Welcome and nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm well, thank you. Thanks. So I wanted to start with Mental Klitoris, which is a really interesting podcast. I want to ask you how you started this project, what the name means to you. I know that initially you were thinking of doing a radio program and then you decided to do a podcast. How come?
I was interning at DEPO, Kültür Sanat, while I was doing my master thesis in University of Arts in Belgrade. And my thesis subject was the art censorship in Turkey since the Gezi protests. So since there was a direct link with DEPO and the Siyah Band project and the people who are involved in these projects, I decided to do my internship there, and I was really curious about what's going on in DEPO. And luckily, DEPO was sharing this street with Açık Radyo. So I spent a lot of time with the people from the radio and from the gallery, the cultural center. And while I was spending time with the people from the radio, I started to think like, maybe I can make my own show. And also I was listening to Açık Radyo when I was in Belgrade. So it was kind of the voice in the house, the familiar voice, what's going on in Turkey, like a friend that I hear inside of the house. And knowing these people, getting involved with these people during that summer was really good. And this idea started to evolve in my mind only, and in my notebooks. So I was taking notes, what should I do? I should do a project about taboos. It wasn't specifically about sexual taboos, but I was thinking, but when we think about the taboos, mostly
they're about sex.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about, like a show about taboos, it wasn't narrowed down first, and then I came back to Turkey, and I was checking what I can do. Should I continue to study? What should I do? This or that? And I was checking all the open calls for the projects, like whatever I could find. And I came across with NewsLabTurkey's incubator open call. So there was this 8-week-long journalism training, which I thought it could be a good update for my journalism skills. And then you're writing your project. And in the beginning, it was 16-episode podcast project, because while I was writing the project, I learned that I cannot say whatever I want to say in a radio which is not an internet radio, which is which has this FM kind of thing, a carousel radio. It's directly connected to the Rütük. So it's
Turkey's
more,
media watchdog.
Yeah, exactly. So it was so likely to be censored.
I see.
And when I was talking to my friends in the radio, they were saying that like if you say penis, we just beep it, or you say this and that, like we directly beep it.
You can't even use those words, scientific words.
Exactly. And also that those were the times the Spotify changed its interface, and it became much more easier to find the podcast and listen to the podcast from the Spotify. Back then, it was only, maybe it wasn't, but it was mostly used for listening music, and then it became like the platform for podcast listening. And some people prefer to listen podcasts from a specific app, but for me, finding the podcasts next to my music playlists, it was much more easier for me to get into the podcast world. So I wrote a podcast project because of these two reasons. One, bypassing the censorship. One, podcasts were becoming popular because of the Spotify's increased interest in podcasts, let's say. And I wrote 16 episodes, sex positive podcast project to NewsLabTurkey. I didn't know back then the name, I was going to call it. And before this incubator project, they invited me to a podcast training by Swedish audio production company Soundtelling. And during that intense training of 3 to 4 days, I don't remember exactly, we had to pitch our podcast ideas. And I was thinking, what should I call it? How should I call it? Like, I'm gonna pitch it, I'm gonna present it in front of the people, so I need to come up with a name. Mental Klitoris was this, a concept we use with my best friend, that something which is like smart, and it touches the, this clitoris in the mind. So it's like eye-opening, it's like critical, something funny.
Stimulating.
Yes, stimulating. We were using, this touched my mental clitoris or something like that. And I wanted to create something which is like, asking questions, letting people to ask questions and things like that. So it was a great match, and it has the sexuality, it has the mental parts, it has the combination. So it started like this. Was it a long answer?
No, it's perfect. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask about podcast culture in general. So, all over the world, podcasts are really popular. Turkey's no exception. And I've noticed in the last maybe 3-4 years especially, there's a whole bunch of new podcasts. I'm curious what the scene is like. Are a lot of people listening to them? Who listens to them? What do you think of these developments?
It's becoming more and more popular, yes, and more popular in a way that more and more people are learning what podcast is. Because in the beginning, like 5 years ago, you had to explain what podcast is. Even like last year or like this year, you could still need to explain it. But now more and more people know about the podcast. That's something. And during the pandemic, during the lockdown actually, people were in their homes, and the podcast is easy to produce. Like if you want to produce a video and podcast, let's compare it. If you need, let's compare the average quality of podcast and the average quality of video. You need much more probably time, resources, equipment to produce an average quality video. But in terms of podcasting, it wasn't that costly or time consuming or anything. So more and more people start do their podcast, and as by yourself you can do it. I think it's easier to work solo in podcasts, and easy to control everything from A to Z. So I think that's why it became more and more popular. But since it was so easy to produce, a lot of podcasts started to emerge. And now we can say that there's like inflation of podcasts. So many podcasts. Sometimes it's hard to find a good podcast. But also, some people started to use this bar in the platforms to do, search. Like people start to search whatever they want to learn about in podcast platforms as well. So it has a good popularity. But I think it's not that easy to get into the lists anymore. Back then, it was much more easier to get into the lists, like to be in the top hundreds of Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify podcasts. Now there are so many podcasts, and it's becoming harder to show yourself or
I see.
Make yourself heard in a way.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's interesting. You were talking about why you didn't do your show on radio. And in some ways, Spotify has opened up this space where you can talk about the kinds of things that you couldn't talk about on radio because of Turkey's censorship laws. But it's also really, difficult because platforms like Spotify and also social media platforms have to now open offices in Turkey, and they're subject in a way to the laws of the Turkey's media watchdog, Rütük, though it's not often enforced yet, at least on Spotify. But then also, I know you've talked about, how difficult using Instagram is, because Instagram, separately from anything related to the Turkish government, has its own regulations about its community guidelines, which means that if you have any content about sexuality, it's often, I think you've even had your own accounts shut down before. So I wanted to ask about, twice. So I wanted to ask about these censorship regimes. On the one hand, you have Turkey's specific ones, and then these social media platform giants who have their own rules. What's it like trying to make your own content between these two walls?
When I started to do podcasts, yes, the censorship was really important. I wanted to bypass censorship. And I wanted to say whatever I wanted to say. And that's why I choose the format, the podcast format. And still, I can upload anything on Spotify and it's still not censored. And also, we are not using the Spotify when we are publishing our episodes. Actually, we are posting our episodes, we are uploading our episodes to a hosting platform. It can be powered by Spotify, but in many cases, Spotify has its own hosting platform, but you can use another one. So if there is a representative from Spotify in Turkey and they censor me, then they need to censor me from Apple too and Google too. So there is still a way, because the podcast technology is not working in that way. It's using the RSS feed technology. So you are putting it in a hosting platform, and hosting platform is distributing your episode to the platforms. So my hosting platform is still not censored, and the listening platforms too. So this still like holding on to the podcast format, you can still bypass censorship. But then when I was thinking of how to promote my podcast, I created my strategies from myself, my own experiences. When I was inspired by the sex positive content, I was seeing this content on Instagram. So I decided that I need to promote my podcast on Instagram, because that was the place that I was inspired. So my second medium in a way became Instagram, like social media. And my Instagram account, Mental Klitoris' Instagram account, became really popular. I was interacting with the listeners through there. I was asking them questions. From their answers, I was feeding my episodes. So it was really, really good. But then maybe 1 year ago, it was banned. The reason for the ban is using the sexual language and providing some sexual services and something like depiction of sexuality or things like that. And yes, because of these new community guidelines, and these community guidelines are in use since December 2020, I guess.
They're pretty new.
Yeah, and it's because of the law called Sesta Fosta Pest. So
in the US.
In the US. From now on, if let's say human trafficking occurs in a platform through using, let's say, Instagram messaging, then Instagram will be held responsible. So this law passed, and then after this law passed, Instagram said, "Oh, okay. Instead of hiring more people who will check which content is like sexually abusive and which content is sexually, like kind of educative or something like sexual good in a way, like eye-opening or something." They didn't say this, of course. They said, okay, like, if this is like reported, then let's ban this account. It's just up to the person who is just probably like sitting in front of the computer all day and deciding, okay, it says sex, so ban it. I don't know. And I got back my account after my friend, a queer friend of mine, had a meeting with Instagram representatives. And then I posted my post after a while, and then it got banned again.
Again, wow.
Yeah, and this one was about the lesbian erotic poetry, this post. And my guest in that episode was a queer poet and also trans activist, Arzu. And she have been targeted so many times. I don't know if the target was Mental Klitoris or Arzu or both, but like today it's still banned. So I was thinking maybe I should give up on Instagram and continue with Twitter, and now Elon Musk is there.
There's no escape, yeah.
Yeah, no escape. I need to find ways to promote my podcast, but still podcast is a good format to do whatever I want to do. But in order to reach people, in order to tell them that I'm doing it there, come and listen, I need to find alternatives.
Yeah.
Now I'm like searching those alternatives,
I
actually.
see. Yeah, they make it really difficult.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of really great Mental Klitoris episodes, some I really like. And the ones I think might interest our viewers most are some of the ones related to art and culture.
And pleasure.
And pleasure, of course, of course. So you mentioned the one on lesbian erotic poetry, which is a really interesting one. There's one about feminist publishing. There's mainstream versus ethical porn, a really interesting episode about that. One I really like about representations of sexuality, often problematic ones in popular song lyrics. So we talked about the negative side of censorship and dealing with these platforms, but I'd like to hear about some of the inspiring work you've come across, particularly when it comes to the cultural sphere in Turkey, that things people are doing.
Yeah, I think it became really good tool to know about many great people and their works. When let's say I did this episode on speciesism and sexuality. So this guest introduced me with Fulden. She is the one who I hosted in the ethical and mainstream porn episode. And one guest led me to another, and I met really, really great people through Mental Klitoris. Let me start from the beginning. The first episodes, first two episodes, I hosted Lara, and Lara was also doing, we were working together in the last podcast that I did for sexual rights are your rights. So she's also talking, giving great talks about queer cinema reading, and things like that. And then I did two episodes with Defne. Defne was doing Rainbow Bulletin in Medyascope.
At Medyascope here, yeah.
Yeah, and then she continues to work her works in other platforms right now, doing videos. And then Fulden, the ethical porn episode guest. She is doing Üzerine Bir Şeyler podcast, and it has a great angle, queer feminist angle, and they are talking about the things. And I also had Biricik Sexual as a guest. Biricik continues their work on Instagram, and they also did a podcast on non-binary existences. I mean, it's There are so many great people. I don't know. I don't want to skip any of them, but let's say Draw for Heal, iyileşme çizimleri. Melis is doing great job. They is drawing with some slogans on healing, and also like it has some figures in those drawings. You can find it on Instagram. It has like Turkish, Kurdish, and English translations of those words, which are accompanying her the visuals. There are so many of them.
That's the great thing about this show is you're introduced to all this work that's really inspiring and interesting.
Yeah.
So that's what I really enjoy about it.
And also you said the problematic lyrics episode. Yine yeniden 90'lar great
a great podcast
on the music and culture. And they had this award. They are awarded from PowerTurk as the best music podcast. It's great. And I have this some collaborations with Velvele. Good things are happening. Like really, even though there are so many censorship and like so many violence, so many discrimination going on around us, we are surrounded by those things. But we are also surrounded by great work of people, especially queer people.
Absolutely, yeah. That's great, yeah. And going back to that episode you mentioned about the song lyrics, about the 1990s and pop music, you know, one thing your show does a lot is talk about, you know, it investigates how we talk about sexuality and the ways that are problematic and also the importance of better forms of representation. I'm curious about what that stuff means to you in terms of how we talk about things and how we can do it better.
Because for me, and probably for many of us, like what we say and what we think and how we act are really like in coordination with each other and very connected. So if we don't remove some of the stuff, like let's say violent things from our mouth, then we cannot remove it from our mind and we cannot remove it from our actions. So that's why if we are becoming more and more inclusive in terms of our languages, then our minds and our actions will be much more inclusive. That's how I think. That's why I'm trying to be as much as I can, inclusive as I can. Because I don't want to offend anyone, I don't want to leave anyone behind, I don't want to leave anyone alienated, anyone, you know, outside of this, let's say, circle in a way. So that's why I think it's really important, like using an inclusive language. And also representation is important because especially queer people are not represented as much, especially in Turkish-speaking mediums and works. So that's also really important for me. That's something I'm really careful of. Like I try to be more and more inclusive because the language is also evolving and changing, and there are new terms for the same things sometimes, but it's just changing and becoming more and more inclusive. So I'm trying to keep updated in that sense. And also, in terms of representation, it's really, really, really important because people want to find something relatable when they are listening you, watching you, reading you. And also relatable in terms of the struggles. If it can be animation, it can be some fantastic work or something, but if the struggle is relatable, then people feel represented in a way, and we are struggling with many things: how we look, how we feel, who we like about everything. So in that sense, I find the representation very, very important, and that's the feeling related in a way, that sense.
Yeah, and I think the people who listen feel that, which is why the show has done so well. I think it really speaks to people in that way. So I wanted to ask you one more question about your other really interesting project, Yayınlanması Kaydıyla, which maybe we can translate as On the Record.
Yes.
So it's a really interesting show. You interview journalists and various people from Turkey's media landscape. Many of these are really experienced and colorful characters. They've lived through periods like the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. They've been really active in the media. So with all these interviews that you've done, what are some of the things that strike you the most, that you find most interesting?
I named it Yayınlanması Kaydıyla, which is you exactly did right in terms of translation. Like it's the reverse of the record. Yeah. So like whatever we are talking in here, I wanted to say through the title, it should be on the record. If you don't want me to publish it, then don't say it to me. So I wanted to give this message from the title, but it wasn't. What is striking? It wasn't like that. Even though you are interviewing with the journalists, like some of the journalists ask me to not to, publish some parts of our interviews, even though the title says, on the record. So this was something a little bit, how to say, hem striking hem de both striking and surprising, because I wasn't. Those are experienced journalists. They should know how to deal with me. Actually, like I'm a young, the colleague of them in a way. So this was something, attract my attention, and also like things are changing in Turkish media landscape. I will come to that, but first I want to talk about my personal takes from those interviews.
Yeah, because they're really interesting interviews, and a lot of people are giving lots of details about the careers, leaving places, getting fired all the time.
That was the thing. Yeah. I said, okay, getting fired is okay. Not everybody should like you. Like these were the things that I started to tell myself. Like you are not gonna be liked by everyone. You are a journalist. You are asking questions. You are gonna disturb people. Be okay with disturbing people. You can get fired. It's okay, as long as you do your work and things like that. So it made me become more confident within the journalism actually, and I became less how to say insecure in terms of my journalistic skills as well and my career at the same time. So this was nice to have it from Yayınlanması Kaydıyla. And also, even though I studied journalism and I had this courses on the history of the journalism, close history, I was still a little bit not enough knowledgeable about those issues. So in the beginning, when I was getting ready for the episodes for the interviews, it was really like huge amount of work, because I was checking who was the owner of that newspaper at the time, who is the prime minister, and everything. So I learned a lot about the history of the Turkish media and media in Turkey. And also, you can see this shift in the ownership, because since we are talking about the careers of the journalists, not what they wrote or what they produced, we are not going in that much details, but we are talking about mostly their careers. It was really becoming more and more clear about these relations between the media and the economic capital and the governments and all these relationships and how they are affecting each other. So it became much more clear for me and probably for the listeners as well.
It's like a history lesson, learning all these eras and who owns the papers and how people transfer from one to another, and it's really fascinating. Yeah. Also,
since it's not this, it's a little bit evergreen format. As you said, it became more like an archive work, which is like an oral history work about the journalists in Turkey. That's it.
Yeah, great. And just one last quick thing. So you've talked to all these people now. You've done all this research about the history of Turkish media. I'm curious what you think has the most changed over the decades. Is it just a story of decline, things getting worse and worse? Or are there things that are worth being hopeful about?
Before the 80s, it was more like the journalist families and journalists were on the directory positions, on the ownership positions. But since the military coup coup in 1980. And after the years with Özal, Turgut Özal, it's becoming much more like neoliberal country, and the business people are starting to own the media outlets, and they own also banks and other stuff. So these relationships between media and the business people and the governments are becoming really, how to say, knotted and in a way, but also like somehow going in some direction. It's like becoming much more complicated in a way. And now I think since the Gezi, we also see journalists are coming up with their own media outlets. Some of them are doing it individually and forming their own teams. Some of them are, let's say, like T24 and like Medyascope, like Doğan Akın, like Ruşen Çakır, are also like becoming the bosses with the journalism background. Coming from that,
not just
coming
capitalists.
from journalism. So journalists are starting to hold these directory positions again. So I think it's a good thing. It's not in this like knotted relationships, I don't know, network or something like that. It's changing, but also like financing of the media is becoming really, really problematic because news are not cheap, and probably the audience will need to take more responsibility in terms of that. I think it's gonna change. Like people started to pay for the good news or the news, so it will become a more like a normal thing to do, I think.
Yeah, I think so, because it's an important resource and it can only happen if we support the people who do it.
Exactly. So I'm not pessimistic.
Good.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Hazal, thanks so much. It was a real pleasure
you.
talking to you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Pop and Politics. We'll see you next week.